All right, guys, we are going to welcome Sarah Casey from Genco Legal. Genco plays legal moneyball by providing corporate legal support to companies nationwide, all at a non-hourly rate. She's here to give us advice on which professions are the most lonely. Oh, that's sad. And also how to get hired if you're a millennial looking for a job. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, Diana. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you. So tell us about this new Harvard study about lawyers and loneliness. How does this correlate?
Yeah, unfortunately, not surprisingly, the study found that law is the loneliest of all professions.
Wow.
They did a study of 2,000 people roughly and found that 67% of lawyers are above the national average in loneliness factors. UCLA came up with a number of factors: feelings of isolation, whether you feel supported in the workplace or outside the workplace, social life, and ultimately lawyers are the loneliest profession officially. Up there as well, engineers at 57%, education at 45%. I was a little surprised at that. Yep. 51% in food service. So we've seen there's a number of professions kind of across the spectrum that are suffering from this phenomenon. And it's serious, Diana. They found that, of course, these can lead to things like depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and a BYU study showed that loneliness can be the equivalent of 15 cigarettes a day. Of course, it doesn't cause cancer, but in terms of health costs, in terms of bad patient outcomes, we've known for a long time that stress causes health issues. Loneliness is its close cousin. It has a lot of the same effects.
So how does loneliness manifest?
Like I said, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, workplace disengagement. A lot of times people will leave jobs. They found that in this study that a lot of folks were leaving within 6 months of having taken the study. It also leads to fewer promotions, self-isolation. People can really close off and remove themselves from collaborative projects and really decrease productivity. A study in Britain found that loneliness cost on an average $3.5 billion a year in productivity across all spectrums or all industries. So that's a big number. It's not only sad, but it also really affects businesses.
What's really interesting, too, is the job fields that you're mentioning. And like you said, law, engineering, education. Education really surprises me because you would think that if, let's say, you're a professor or a teacher, that you're having a lot of interaction on a daily basis with your students. Did they explain in the Harvard study why this particular profession was correlating with loneliness?
They didn't for this study. They wanted more of a global look across different professions. It's a great question, though, Diana. Somebody should definitely dig into it. I think a lot of people will be surprised by that. But an interesting related note, they did find that education, higher levels of education, correlated with higher degrees of loneliness. Professional degrees like law, medicine, dentistry were 25% lonelier than folks with bachelor's degrees or high school degrees, and graduate degrees were 20% more lonelier than bachelor's or graduate degrees. So there's a bit of an ivory tower effect, high pressure, high performance, high expectations that I think people don't realize that they're really feeling overwhelmed.
Do you think that technology is playing a part in loneliness being attributed to the professions that you choose?
Oh, it's a huge part of it. Technology is both, it's two sides of the same coin. It's both a way that we're really able to collaborate and communicate in a way that we've never been able to before, but it's also a way where people can really shut down and get stuck behind the screen. I saw a very interesting article the other week in Japan, and I'll butcher the Japanese term for it, so I'll leave it alone, but there's a phenomenon of people dying alone in their apartments and not being discovered for a long period of time. And as morbid as that is, and Japan has a very elderly population, but it's the realization that people are really self-isolating, and that it's that serious that people need to be engaged and participating in social functions. A lot of these folks were still working. They were working remotely. They were otherwise trying to be productive, but they're isolated in a way that's ultimately very, very tragic.
It's incredibly tragic, and it makes you think, well, what can corporations be doing to be engaging their employees so that they don't become part of this, what almost sounds like a loneliness epidemic without sounding dramatic. But for the lawyers in particular, there's a stereotype with lawyers. I'm very sorry about that, Sarah, but there is that they're the quote unquote bad guys. They're sharks. Do you think that stereotype plays into lawyers being the loneliest, sorry.
I think it's hard to tell cause and effect there. I personally like bad lawyer jokes. I think blonde jokes are funny too. I have a self-deprecating sense of humor. But there's a lot of things that internal and external pressures that are unique to the practice of law that I think really contribute to it. Internally, most law firms are driven by, and performance metrics are driven by, the billable hour. 6-minute increments, you're pushed to hit a number of hours a month, and that's ultimately how you're compensated. For clients of law firms, the bigger the issue, the more dollars you're spending. So there's a natural tension between the lawyer and their client. The profession by its nature is very adversarial. So there's a lot of factors that are somewhat unique to law that I think contribute to that. I'll give a couple examples, and I do not have a second career in stand-up, but they're good examples for why people don't like lawyers and why our firm prides ourselves on being non-lawyer lawyers. We don't do billable hours. So I'll give an example. Bear with me, Diana. So a guy goes to heaven, goes up to the pearly gates, and he says, "Peter, I'm too young to die. I'm only 55. And Peter says, "No, it says here that you're 90. And the guy says, "Well, how'd you get that?" And he said, "Well, we counted up your timesheets."
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
So, clients really feel that their hours are inflated, they're too expensive, and they also get very frustrated with the length of legal battles. We're in a litigious society. Cases take forever and ever to get to a resolution, and they take dollars upon dollars upon dollars, oftentimes in ways that can put your company at risk of bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. So one more, Diana, bear with me.
Oh, I'm liking these.
What's the difference between a bad lawyer and a good lawyer?
What?
A bad lawyer drags your case on and on for years and years. A good lawyer does it for even longer.
That makes sense. And we had a comment via Facebook. Accuracy in Media said, yes, that's what they say. It's lonely at the top. You have fewer people to confide in about your problems. Then that makes sense too, even from confidentiality. You can't go and share your frustration with the case when you do have a client privilege that you have to go by.
It's true. Although I put the responsibility on employers, and as COO of my firm, I accept this responsibility directly, that it's on you to engage your workforce. Of course, we're working long hours. We have heavy caseloads, but we're also in an economy of collaboration and sharing. And I don't know why law has been still tends to be a closed door, tunnel vision, at your desk type of profession, as opposed to ask the partner in the firm who might have that expertise or that resource that you could use. That partner should be volunteering if they know something's come through the firm that they can collaborate and add value on. So I put a lot of that onus on the employer to say, you need to engage your people, and particularly when it's a millennial workforce, which I know we'll talk about more in a second. But millennials are seeking collaboration, mentoring, and a lot of that will naturally combat this loneliness epidemic. And it is an epidemic. Diana, you were spot on with that word. Well,
you just pivoted into the millennial issue, should we call it, where millennial does have a bad word. I mean, people kind of use it as a dig. They'll say, well, you're a millennial, or don't act like a millennial. But how does that actually affect the hiring process for millennials?
Oh, sure. Well, the reality is that it's estimated by 2025 that 75% of the workforce will be millennials. So regardless of your opinions one way or the other, whether you think millennials are entitled and spoiled and buried in their phones, or you think they're the next best thing for the workforce and entrepreneurial ventures. The reality is that they're the lifeblood of your company. So companies, and particularly baby boomer owned and run companies, need to understand that they, in order to attract top millennial talent as their workforce ages out, they have to do things differently. Things have shifted seismically from previous generations to now a millennial workforce, and you have to adapt or die.
So is millennial still considered a dirty word for employers, or is this changing?
I think it's changing. Some industries more quickly than others. Startup, tech, entrepreneurial driven are much more millennial friendly. Some of your more traditional industries, not so much, but again, they're having to hire millennials, good or bad. The reality, though, is that millennials are the most educated and the most tech savvy of any generation ever, of course. So rather than give them the bad rap of buried in the phone or stuck on social media, why don't you use those tools to further your business, whether it's social media marketing, whether it's attracting millennial talent by really designing work programs and positions for millennials. It's been very clear that millennials seek three things, and this is across all industries. They want flexible working relationships, they want meaningful mentorship, and they want a sense of mission. There was a very interesting Deloitte study that said 9 out of 10 millennials felt that a company's success should be measured on something other than financials, which is a big shift from what we've seen in previous generations. Yes. The more money a company makes, the longer people can be employed there and have a sense of security. Whereas millennials have a sense of corporate responsibility, and they need to be engaged. They do get bored quickly. We're in a very consumer-driven, very instant gratification type of society where if you don't recognize that in your millennial workforce, you are going to lose their attention span. And the studies have shown that millennials leave jobs on average every 3 years. That's a huge attrition rate for employers to be dealing with.
That is because the investment is a short-lived one. So for an employer that's watching right now who might be a little skittish about employing a millennial, what would they be missing out if they decide to not choose from that generation?
Technology is a big part of it. I hate to keep banging that drum, but you have to catch up with the times. We're a global, sharing, collaborative economy. Your millennial workforce can give you that level of access and sophistication and engagement. Ultimately, we're seeing employers are also making a shift. We saw a GE move from Stamford, Connecticut, which is a beautiful, nice place to live, but they moved to Boston because they realize that top millennial talent wants to work in hub cities. We're getting consistent feedback from these large organizations that they want to be where the action is. We also see that leadership programs, millennials respond extremely well to a clear path to responsibility and accountability. They need to know what each of those metrics are along the way in order to stay engaged and ultimately keep them long term. DaVita Healthcare runs a very successful leadership program where right out of school, they have a $50 million portfolio that their new employees can start managing right out of school, from strategic growth plans, finances, recruiting, where they can fast track in a leadership position if they're able to stand out in that role. So that's the type of meaningful programs that will attract millennials to you, and most importantly, will keep them for the long term. Now, as a millennial, you have a responsibility too. When you go into that interview, you hope that the person on the other side isn't stereotyping you. But if there's a boomer sitting across the table, there's a possibility that they have some of these negative stigmas in their head. Just come right out and own it. Say, I'm a millennial, but here's a reference that can speak to my work ethic. Or I heard you talking about some challenges you have in project management. Here's a technology tool that I found really increases efficiency and real-time communication. And then finally, you have to be realistic. Go in with what you would like your path to be, and make the ask for what's most important to you. ultimately, if you want to be CEO, you're going to have to outwork everybody else. That's just reality. No one ever did that working from 9 to 5.
Right.
But if your family is important, if having flexibility in your hours or ability to work remotely, if that's something that's important to you, verbalize. Because ultimately, if you're not having that really candid discussion, and that goes both ways, employer to employee, then it's ultimately not going to be a fit long term for either. And we're finding that so many companies, and your particularly progressive companies, are offering very millennial-driven job functions and pathways to success. That ultimately, if that's not what you think is right for your company, I think that's a dangerous position to take. But that millennial will find another job that's a better fit. So I think that goes both ways.
Those are some excellent tips, very helpful for someone that is joining the workforce or as a millennial looking to get out of a certain job after their 3 years. So thank you so much for joining us, Sarah Casey from Genco Legal.
Thanks, Diana. It's a pleasure.